In 1824, a German military doctor working out of a hospital in Venezuela created a bitter herbal tonic to treat sick soldiers. He called it Amargo Aromatico. He figured it would help a few dozen men with stomach problems. That was 1824. By 1900, that same formula was sitting on the bar of nearly every major hotel in New York, London, and Paris, and bartenders were calling it the single ingredient no cocktail could survive without. The doctor's name was Johann Gottlieb Benjamin Siegert, and the tonic's journey from a wartime hospital on the banks of the Orinoco River to the most famous little bottle in every bar on earth is one of the strangest stories in food history. Siegert's original formula for his aromatic bitters would later become the exact thing that defined an entire era of cocktail culture. But in 1824, it was just medicine, handed to soldiers who couldn't keep their food down. To make sense of how that happened, you need to know who Siegert was before he ever set foot in South America. Johann Siegert was born in 1796 in a small town in the Silesian region of Prussia, in what is now Poland. He studied medicine in Berlin and became an army doctor while still practically a teenager. At 19 years old, he was serving as a surgeon with the Prussian forces in the Napoleonic Wars. He wasn't sitting in a field hospital far from the action. He was at Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815, tending to the wounded among the 125,000 Prussians who marched under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher to reinforce the Duke of Wellington against Napoleon. Try to picture what that looked like for a 19-year-old doctor. Roughly 55,000 casualties across 4 square miles by the time the sun set. Musket wounds, cannon injuries, amputations performed in barns by candlelight. Siegert survived it, earned a significant rank as a staff surgeon, and came out the other side with a skill set that most doctors his age couldn't imagine. But peacetime Prussia wasn't enough for him. Siegert was, by all accounts, a man who wanted to be wherever history was being made. And in 1820, something big was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Simon Bolivar had just liberated Venezuela from Spanish colonial rule and was pushing to free the rest of South America. Bolivar needed doctors. Specifically, he needed experienced battlefield surgeons who could handle the casualties of a revolution that was far from over. Siegert signed up. He crossed the Atlantic and landed in the Venezuelan port town of Angostura, a trading hub on the vast Orinoco River. Bolivar, clearly impressed by Siegert's resume, appointed him Surgeon General of the military hospital there. Angostura was Bolivar's political and military base. The town would later be renamed Ciudad Bolivar in the general's honor. The hospital was overwhelmed. Soldiers and civilians were suffering from fevers, dysentery, stomach cramps, and all the digestive disasters that come from living in a tropical climate with little clean water and a diet your body has never encountered before. Sailors arriving from ports across the Caribbean and beyond were in equally bad shape. Seasickness, dehydration, and weeks of bad provisions had wrecked their systems. Siegert was a scientist first. He started experimenting with the tropical plants growing all around him, testing herbs, roots, barks, and spices for their medicinal properties. He was looking for something that could settle the stomach, reduce fever, and actually work in a way that the limited remedies of early 19th century medicine simply didn't. 4 years. That's how long it took him to get it right. 4 years of grinding bark, steeping roots, measuring ratios, testing batches on patients, and starting over when results fell short. In 1824, Siegert finally perfected his formula. A concentrated blend built on a base of gentian root, combined with dozens of other botanicals that he selected from the tropical plants growing along the Orinoco. The result was bitter but drinkable, aromatic and intense, with an almost medicinal punch that cut through nausea and settled the stomach in ways that nothing else available at the time could match. He called it Amargo Aromatico, which translates to aromatic bitters, and it worked. Soldiers who had been bedridden with stomach complaints and dysentery started recovering. Patients with tropical fevers showed improvement. Civilian settlers who had been suffering ever since they'd arrived in the Venezuelan heat found relief for the first time. The tonic became a fixture in the hospital and then in Siegert's private practice. I mean, think about that for a second. A product that is now synonymous with cocktail bars and old leather chair lounges, was born inside a military hospital during a South American revolution. Nobody in that hospital was thinking about whiskey drinks. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Siegert had only intended to use his bitters on his own patients, maybe share them with friends and family. But Angostura was a port town, and the Orinoco River brought ships from everywhere. British, Dutch, French, and American vessels docked there regularly, and their crews were in rough shape. Seasickness was a constant misery for sailors in that era, and Siegert's aromatic bitters gave them genuine relief. British Royal Navy officers were among the first to take notice. They started buying bottles of the stuff and bringing it aboard their ships. And you have to remember, the British Navy in this era was everywhere. Their ships connected the Caribbean to Europe, to Africa, to Asia. A product that impressed a British naval officer in Angostura could be sitting on a bar table in London 6 weeks later. Sailors being sailors, word of the tonic spread from port to port across the Caribbean, then to England, and eventually around the globe. Within 6 years of its creation, Angostura bitters were being formally exported to England and Trinidad. The bitters ended up in nearly every sailor's sea chest, right next to the hardtack and the compass. Sailors called the tonic by the town it came from, Amargos de Angostura. The name stuck. And here's a detail that still shapes how we drink today. Those British sailors started mixing the bitters with their daily gin rations. They weren't trying to invent a cocktail. They had no concept of cocktail culture. They were just trying to make their medicine go down easier. But what they accidentally created was one of the earliest versions of what we'd now call a mixed drink, a rough ancestor of the pink gin. The British Royal Navy, without meaning to, became the world's first cocktail distributor. By 1850, demand had outpaced what Siegert could produce in his spare time. He resigned his military commission entirely to focus on manufacturing the bitters full-time. He renamed the product Angostura after the town where he developed it. And to be clear, Angostura bitters contain no Angostura bark. The name comes from the town, not the tree. That's a misconception that has followed the product for 2 centuries. Siegert started entering his bitters in international competitions. The product won medals at the London International Exhibition of Industry and Art in 1862 and at the World Trade Fair in Paris in 1867. This was a battlefield stomach remedy competing against the finest products in Europe, and it was winning. For a while, things actually seemed stable. The business was growing, the accolades were rolling in, and Siegert had built something with real international reach. That didn't last. On the 13th of September, 1870, Johann Siegert died at the age of 74 in the town he'd made famous. He never left Venezuela, and the business he'd built from tropical herbs and wartime necessity passed to his sons, Carlos, Alfredo, and Luis. Enter the Siegert brothers, and the decisions they made over the next few years would define the brand for the next century and a half. Venezuela was falling apart. The political instability that had simmered for decades was boiling over into civil unrest, and by 1875, the Siegert brothers decided they had to leave. They packed up the family operation, carried their father's secret recipe with them, and relocated to Port of Spain, Trinidad. Manufacturing of Angostura aromatic bitters began in Trinidad that same year, and it has never moved since. The sons were more commercially minded than their father had been. Johann was a scientist and a doctor. Carlos, in particular, was a businessman with a global perspective. He traveled as far as Australia to promote the bitters, collecting gold medals from trade fairs along the way. The product won the Medal of Excellence in Vienna, Austria, in 1873, and a gold medal for product excellence at the World Trade Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. And then came the label. Before one competition, the brothers decided to redesign their packaging. They split the work between them. One brother designed a new bottle, the other designed a new label. And because this is a story about a family that crossed an ocean with a secret formula during a civil war, of course neither brother thought to check in with the other about sizing. By the time they realized what had happened, the labels were too big for the bottles. Way too big. The paper stuck up around the neck of the bottle like an oversized jacket on a kid. and there was no time to fix it before the competition deadline. So they slapped the huge labels on the small bottles and submitted them anyway. They lost the competition, but one of the judges pulled them aside afterward and told them to keep the design exactly as it was. The mismatched packaging, the judge said, would ensure that Angostura bitters would always stand out on any shelf. And no, I'm not making that up. The Siegert brothers took the advice. And a century and a half later, every single bottle of Angostura bitters still ships with a label that is too big for it. The mistake became one of the most recognizable pieces of packaging in the world. Other brands have tried to copy it. None have pulled it off the same way. If the Siegert brothers had stopped at the label, that alone would make a good story. But the secrecy around the recipe is where things get genuinely wild. The formula Siegert created in 1824 has never been changed. Not once in over 200 years. And only 5 people on the planet know what's in it at any given time. Those 5 people have made a pact. They never fly on the same airplane. They never eat at the same restaurant at the same time. The idea is that no single accident, no crash, no disaster could take out everyone who carries the recipe. On top of that, the formula is reportedly locked in a vault in a bank in the United States, so production could theoretically continue even if all 5 were somehow lost. The production process itself is a whole operation. Raw ingredients are gathered from locations around the world and shipped to England first. In England, each ingredient is packaged separately and given a coded label. Nobody handling the shipment in England knows the full formula because no single shipment contains every component. The coded packages are then sent to Trinidad, where they pass through customs without inspection, thanks to a long-standing agreement between the Siegert family and Trinidadian customs authorities. Once the packages arrive at the House of Angostura in Port of Spain, they're carried up to a small, windowless room on the upper floor of the factory. The company calls it the Sanctuary. That is where the 5 people who know the recipe do the actual measuring, grinding, and blending. If you work in the mail room at Angostura, you handle every package and still have no idea what goes into the product. The secrecy is total. What we do know is limited. Gentian. Root is the confirmed bittering agent. The liquid is 44.7% alcohol by volume, nearly 90 proof. It smells like cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, and dried orange peel. The rest is speculation. Some estimates suggest over 40 individual ingredients, but nobody outside the sanctuary knows for sure. All right, so here's where the bitters stopped being medicine and started being something else entirely. While the Siegert family was building their operation in Trinidad, a separate revolution was happening in bars across the United States. The 1880s and 90s were the golden age of the American cocktail. Bartenders were experimenting with combinations of spirits, sugar, and bitters in ways that hadn't been done before. The word cocktail itself had been defined as early as 1803 in the farmer's cabinet as a drink made of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters. Those 4 ingredients are, of course, exactly what makes an old-fashioned. By the 1880s, bartenders were getting creative, adding liqueurs and fancy garnishes to their drinks, and some customers pushed back. They wanted the original thing, the old-fashioned way, and so the name stuck. In 1862, Jerry Thomas published his Bartender's Guide, which is one of the earliest known cocktail books. It included a recipe for an old-fashioned Holland gin cocktail calling for 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. By 1895, a version of the old-fashioned whiskey cocktail made with Angostura bitters, water, and a sugar cube was published in Modern American Drinks by George Capella. The drink's connection to Angostura was official and permanent. The Manhattan, created around 1874, also called for Angostura. So did a growing list of drinks that would define American bar culture for the next 100 years. If a cocktail recipe simply says bitters without specifying a brand, it means Angostura. That's been true since the 19th century. What makes this particularly wild is that none of it was planned. Siegert never imagined his stomach tonic ending up in a whiskey glass. The sailors who spread it around the world were looking for relief from nausea, not a flavor enhancer. The sons who moved the company to Trinidad were fleeing political violence, not chasing the cocktail market. Every step of the journey happened because someone found a new use for something that was designed to do something completely different. The 20th century brought Prohibition in the United States, which nearly killed cocktail culture entirely. From 1920 to 1933, it was illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages across the country. Speakeasies kept spirits flowing underground, but legitimate bars and their recipes were wiped off the map. Thousands of bartenders left the profession. Cocktail knowledge that had been passed down for decades was lost. But Angostura bitters survived, and the reason is almost comically simple. The product was classified as a food flavoring, not a beverage. Nobody drinks Angostura bitters straight. The bottle is too concentrated, too bitter, too potent, at 44.7% alcohol to be consumed on its own. A few dashes in a drink contain a negligible amount of actual alcohol. So while whiskey went underground and entire distilleries shut down, the bitters stayed on the shelf in grocery stores and kitchens, quietly waiting for the bars to reopen. When Prohibition ended and bars came back, Angostura was right there. The old-fashioned came back. The Manhattan came back. And through every shift in drinking trends across the 20th century, from the tiki craze of the 1950s to the vodka and soda era of the 1980s, that little bottle with the wrong-sized label never left the bar. It survived trends that killed entire spirit categories. The craft cocktail movement that started around 2000 brought everything full circle. A new generation of bartenders began treating cocktails like fine cuisine, sourcing quality spirits, making their own syrups and tinctures, and rediscovering recipes from bartender guides published in the 1800s. Angostura bitters, which had never changed its formula in almost 2 centuries, was suddenly the coolest thing on the bar again. Not because it was new, but because it had always been there, and people finally remembered why it mattered. Today, the House of Angostura is based in Laventille, just outside Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. The company has expanded into rum production, including well-regarded bottles like the Angostura 1919 and the Angostura 1824, named after the year Siegert perfected his bitters. They also launched Angostura Orange Bitters in 2007 and Cocoa Bitters in 2020, made with locally grown Trinitario cocoa. But the Aromatic bitters remain the flagship. The same formula from 1824. The same oversized label from a competition nobody won. The same 5-person secrecy protocol. The same coded shipments passing through customs without a single inspection. John George, a master distiller at Angostura, once put it this way when speaking to the press. He said that right alongside the steel band and calypso, Angostura bitters is something Trinidad has given to the world. He acknowledged that it technically came from Venezuela, but said that it's been in Trinidad forever, and they claim it now. Johann Siegert, the battlefield surgeon who crossed an ocean to join someone else's revolution, invented what he believed was medicine. He called it a cure. Sailors called it a lifesaver. And 2 centuries later, bartenders call it the one ingredient you can't skip. A few drops in a glass with whiskey, sugar, and a twist of citrus, and you've got the old-fashioned, a cocktail that predates the telephone, the light bulb, and the automobile, and still outsells most things invented last year. That drink cannot exist without what Siegert created in a Venezuelan hospital in 1824. The recipe has not changed, not once. The label still doesn't fit the bottle. And the 5 people who know the formula are, right now, almost certainly in 5 different places. If you found this one worth sticking around for, subscribe. I cover stories like this every week. And if you want another deep cut from the history of things hiding in plain sight, that video is on screen now.